Hello there, I'm George Hall, and welcome back to another instalment of the Good Growth Podcast. Now, today we're bringing you the third and final part of our Introduction to Good Growth Technology episode. So back at the start of May, Good Growth CTO Jake Clarkson sat down with me to talk through the acquisition of Amigo Technology. Well, Jake, first of all, we've spoken about constraints, be it time, money, resource that businesses could be suffering from. Keen to know how you think we work best. Is there a way that you see good growth technology best implemented within clients?
Yeah, sure. So I should say, in keeping with the insight and innovation at speed within current constraints, so not only do we want to operate within current constraints, we don't want to add any more constraints, so we don't want to make the problem any worse. So to that end, one of the ways that we've achieved that is to make implementation of our technology as simple as possible. And the same applies to working with us on the data front. So on the technology front, it's simply a case of adding our JavaScript tag to the site, and that's it. So there's no tagging up, adding special data attributes or custom attributes to identify elements, setting up, placing elements into a data layer or anything like that. Just add the tag and we'll do the rest. And as an aside, because of that simplicity, we're able to show demos to any prospective client using a browser extension, because we can simply say, on machines that have that browser extension, add the tag, as if client X had implemented it. And that's all that has to be done. So we want to make the integration and installation, I suppose, in some sense, as simple as possible. I should say there's no need to selectively install the tag as well. Talk later maybe about what happens when the tag loads, and a bit more about the lifting the lid maybe a little bit on the technology. But in terms of how we best work with clients, so there are different ways that we can identify tests or experiences to run. So there are two primary ways. So it's through our clients' ideas. So that could be gut instinct. It could be stuff that's worked well with, in competitors. Maybe someone's moved from company X that's a competitor to company Y. So that could be a source of ideas. It can be data driven. So maybe where a client has already done some analysis, they've identified that this shows potential. Again, back to that point of innovation, carrying some inherent risk. It's not guaranteed to provide a positive outcome, but it's all the data suggesting it will. So that's one source of ideas. We have extensive expertise in particularly e-commerce and working with people selling stuff online. So we can bring all of that knowledge and expertise to the table. So that's we like to have a well-filled backlog, for want of a better term, of ideas that we can run through in conjunction with our clients. We want, ideally with our clients, we want to get to a point where they buy into this idea of testing at speed. So let's say we want to deliver some functionality for a prospective client. We want to try and break them out of this idea of what it means to develop a feature, quote unquote, properly. What does it mean to do software engineering properly? And we can maybe talk about that a little bit and unpack that a little bit. So if we hear things like, we need to get that API integration, we'll have to get that sort of deep, we have to go through that committee in order to get that done, or we'll have to, essentially drawing us back into the system, in aggregate, that exhibits those challenges that we talked about earlier, the organisation complexity, the cost, the time, the lack of resources. If we're kind of the gravitational pull is bringing us back into that, that's when there can be some challenges. So in an ideal situation, we would look to get to a place with clients where we can operate not I say independently, and I know that could raise some concerns. What do you mean by independently? So that's not to say just let us do what we want, give us carte blanche to do anything. That's absolutely not what we're saying. When I say independently, maybe a useful clarification is that we're seeking to work independently from a technology perspective and from a data perspective. So the analogy of making it easy to install the technology would be that we make it as easy as possible to deal with, to interact with this on a data level. Grant us access to Google Analytics, we'll do the rest, would be the equivalent, as opposed to add this data point, create this segment, all that kind of stuff. We will do all of that. So on both dimensions of data and tech, we want it to be as easy. And another way I like to describe it is we want you to focus on what you want to do, not how, not the mechanical process of getting there. So back to the question of how do we work best. So a place where we can operate independently from a tech and data perspective, but where we want the client involved and engaged with the process. We want to make our sponsors and counterparts in our clients look great. We want to be part of the team. We don't want to be this sort of thing operating in the shadows that no one's allowed to know about. We want to be involved, and another way I think about good growth and what we're trying to achieve as a business is that, let's say X or N, years time, it would, due to sort of the philosophy that we've sort of brought and allowed to become sort of possible in the world, is that people would think, why not try that? Why would you ever commit to a 3-month allocation of a development squad without having tested it first? So we're trying to expand the boundaries of what people think is testable, as opposed to thinking that's too hard to test, that's outside the bounds of testing. And just as a concrete example, it's still hypothetical and no client IP being revealed here. So let's say something like we want to store a new piece of data against a customer account. So the traditional way, of course, we think, well, okay, we have to go into, update table, user, add column, whatever the new thing is we want to store. So you're updating a database, you're updating the app, the app player, if we go with some kind of N-tier architecture. You're having to update the UI, maybe that's hitting 3 separate people. You're then into organizational complexity, an exponential time increase. You're having to, they might be able to work in at different times. So that's one way of approaching it. Our approach would be, well, don't worry about storing it properly, in the database. Store it using good growth technology, GGT. And then if it turns out that adding data point X or feature X to the user account is worthwhile, then, well, you've got the spec because we've iterated on it together. Sure. So you can give that to your, the spec is, have a play with it, use it. And of course we can be a bit more detailed than that, of course, in terms of handling edge cases and documenting that for clients, developers. So yes, that's a concrete example. And it does illustrate the broader point that in order to do that, our technology, unlike CRO tools, A/B testing tools, it has to be feature complete as a tech stack. So, it's got to have its own database, so it can store data decoupled from the web. And we've talked a lot about the web, but, there's nothing that limits good growth technology, GGT, to the web. It's ultimately it speaks HTTP, it speaks the language of the web, so, and it has APIs, so it can work in a completely headless context as well, like an IoT device, for example. But yes, so our technology has to be sort of feature complete with regard to tech stack. So have its own database, have its own decision-making engine, Boolean logic, at the end of the day. It has to be able to make changes on a website. It has to be able to speak JavaScript, CSS and HTML in order to cover that space. And so yes, independence from our clients from a technology and data perspective, and buying into that philosophy. So it doesn't have to be done properly.
Sure.
I could perhaps just briefly comment on what it means to do something properly. Because some may hear that and think, it's just the old Facebook or Meta, nay Facebook approach of move fast and break things, that kind of thing. It's not a sort of Silicon Valley style. It's just hack our way to some kind of global maximum. When I say do things properly, there are certain things, particularly in large enterprises, but really any business, there are certain boxes that must be ticked, of course. So, whether that's compliance, whether that's performance, so if you say, so we've got the great solution, it takes 50 seconds to respond, you slow down your website, then that's of course not acceptable. So there are certain, foundational things that must be ticked off before any client should, entertain working with us. And all of those we can talk about. I'd like to think that we do tick all those boxes. Then it comes back, I think for me, we go back to what's a relatively nascent field in computer science, computer programming. If we can stretch it back to, back to my daughter with Ada Lovelace, we can go back that far if we really want to, but I think that's probably generous to say that directly influences how we code today. But if we go back to, the 50s, and we've got the emergence from, electrical engineering, maths, of course, and where does computer science belong? The work of Turing, Gödel, all those kind of people. Where does it belong? So I think coming out of maths and the electrical engineering, I think there's a degree of let's switch over to engineering and maybe go from electrical engineering to sort of civil engineering and say, well, let's build a bridge. It doesn't matter if it falls down. There might be people on it, but whatever. That just doesn't work. So it has to be robust. It has to be well thought out. You have to think about all the edge cases, within some margin of error, of course, up front. And of course, I'm not suggesting that we do away with that and just start, start experimenting on that kind of scenario. But I think that legacy, I know that, of course, with maths, that, from the axioms, if this, then that, and it all flows from those foundations. So it's either right or wrong to some extent. So I think these legacies are still in software engineering, and so how can we sort of challenge that? And that's what I want to. That's the thing I'm personally very passionate about, is allowing people to enact change. To free people from these so-called best practices. And again, I'm not here to say that having tests for your code is bad practice. Absolutely not. But I think there are certain things that do hold back development teams. And so our goal is to, back to the question about ideal clients, is getting that buy-in that will just find a way, for want of a less extreme way of putting it, a way to test this functionality that ticks all the boxes: compliance, speed, security, etc. But just allows me to test it quickly. Sure. And so that's really what we're looking for buy-in from our clients.
Sure. And Jake, before we finish up, it's been brilliant to get an intro into what was Amigo and is now Good Growth Technology, and also an intro to yourself as well. Finally, I'd love to hear what the future holds for GGT in your view. Is it more of the same? Is it branching out? Is it something else entirely? How do you see things panning out?
Yeah, sure. So in some sense, more of the same. In terms, a little bit about the technology. So a constant source of inspiration to me is really the Bell Labs days. Talked a little bit about the history of software engineering already, and you go back to people from the Unix room. Your Ken Thompsons, your Dennis Ritchies, your Brian Kernigans, Doug McElroy, all those kind of people, and those people really inspired the design of the, particularly Unix, the operating system, have inspired GGT, Good Growth Technology, what was Amigo. And so I mentioned that just as general interest. Feel free to message me about Unix if you're listening to this. As an aside, my wife can't quite understand why I'm reading a book of Unix, a history and a memoir on holiday, but I find it interesting. I'm sure there are others out there that do as well, so please reach out if you do. But the design is similar. So something with Unix that its simplicity is something that we seek to, that we strive for within Good Growth Technology.
Sure.
So, as an aside, not just from that book that I mentioned, but where Unix came out of a system that had become massively complicated. People have lost interest in it because it was too complicated. To the point where Bell Labs washing their hands of operating systems because they've been burnt so badly by it. And the response wasn't, okay, let's create something even more complicated because that's how we get something good. But let's actually just distill this down to something simple. Sure. How do we cover this with a sort of a minimum number of what we call orthogonal, complementary, independent features to cover the space rather than lots of point solutions here. So as we go on with the future of good growth technology, somewhat maybe surprisingly, we're not seeking to just add bits left, right and centre. We're seeking to evolve the platform so that it can tackle more problems, but in a sort of elegant way. And a measure of, if you've achieved or you've been successful in that type of software engineering is that it's easier to maintain because there's less parts to maintain, but you find that each of the components sort of just work well and work naturally together, and you'll find yourself somewhere down the line saying, oh, we can do that, because that just works with that. And that's why it comes back to Unix, the inspiration of the Unix shell, the commands within there, pipes, all that kind of stuff. So as we evolve the platform, there are some cool new features, such as being able to work server-side, and that's more than server-side in the sense of hit the Good Growth Technology API and we'll tell you if it's A or B, but actually being able to run Good Growth Technology experiences in a headless context. So that's quite a cool one. There are lots of other features coming which I could talk about for quite a long time, but the key thing I think to say is that we're not just seeking to grow in sort of arbitrary dimensions, but we'll seek to carefully improve the platform in such a way that it will benefit not only new clients but all our existing ones as well.
Well, Jake, it's been great talking to you. And I think one thing I can say for sure is that you wouldn't be short of mastermind specialist subjects if ever the opportunity arose. But it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. And look, I'm already looking forward to the next time we have you on the podcast. So, Jake, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, George. I'll get back to my double espresso now. It's a bit cold, but there we go. Cheers, George.
Well, that was the last part of our Intro to GGT podcast. And it was great to round it off. And I promise it won't be the last time you hear from Jake on this podcast. As always, we may have left you with answers, we may have left you with questions, but either way, it would be great to hear from you. We're Good Growth, a data and technology business trusted by global brands to grow market share and profitability of e-commerce and digital channels. You can email us at inquiries@goodgrowth.co.uk or have a look at our website, which is goodgrowth.co.uk. Thanks very much for listening.